It was one of those evenings when everything felt unnervingly still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, something he frequently did with little notice. I had grown accustomed to it, or so I convinced myself. But tonight, the quiet felt different. I was sitting on the couch, aimlessly scrolling through my phone, when my eyes wandered to the backyard, and there he was, Ben, Mark's closest friend. Mark had asked Ben to stop by and check on me while he was away, to make sure everything was fine. At the time, it hadn't seemed like much to think about. After all, Ben was practically family, dependable, charming, without being overbearing, and always willing to help. But tonight felt off. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled me. It was the way I began noticing things I had never paid attention to before. The way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders as he worked in the yard, or how his dark hair curled at the back of his neck, damp with sweat. I shook my head, scolding myself. What am I thinking? This is Ben. Good old Ben. But a fleeting thought, one I shouldn't even consider, lingered in my mind. When he finally came inside, wiping his hands on his jeans, I realized I hadn't moved from the couch. I finished tightening the gate latch, he said with a smile. That thing was about to fall off. Thanks, Ben, I murmured, trying not to focus too much on how his smile made his eyes crinkle. He always knows what needs fixing. He shrugged, happy to help. Mark would never forgive me if I didn't. We stood there for a moment in an awkward silence, thick and palpable. I felt like I should offer him a drink, but instead, something else slipped out. Something reckless. Do you think you could help me with one more thing? I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended. Ben raised an eyebrow, curious but not questioning. Sure, what do you need? I hesitated, biting my lip. It wasn't an outrageous request, but the way it formed in my mind made it feel wrong. Something I'd never ask of him under normal circumstances. I need help moving some furniture upstairs, I said, my heart racing more than it should. Mark promised he'd do it, but you know how that goes. I tried to sound casual, but even I could tell how odd it sounded. Ben gave me a half smile, as though he sensed there was more to my request than I was letting on. But he didn't question it. Sure, he said. Lead the way. I turned and started up the stairs, knowing he was close behind. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the banister, but I told myself it was just nerves. It's nothing, just a favor. When we reached the bedroom, I pointed to the dresser. It's too heavy for me to move by myself, I explained, though I could hear the slight tremor in my voice. Ben stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between us. He flashed me that easy smile again, the kind that made him seem carefree. No problem, he said. We'll have it moved in no time. I stepped back and watched as he positioned himself to lift the dresser. His muscles tensed under the weight, and I realized, with a pang of guilt, that I wasn't just asking for help with furniture. I was asking for something more, something neither of us had acknowledged out loud. Ben grunted slightly as he lifted one end of the dresser, his arms straining. I grabbed the other end, though I wasn't much help. The truth was, I could have waited for Mark to come back and handle it. There was no urgency, but having Ben here felt different. As we moved the dresser, the air between us shifted, subtle but undeniable. I could feel it, thick like the humidity before a storm. His arm brushed against mine by accident, and though it was just a brief touch, it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was just nerves again, or maybe guilt. When we finally set the dresser down, I stepped back, pretending to adjust a vase on top of it to avoid looking directly at him. I could feel his gaze linger, cautious yet curious. "All done?" he asked, exhaling as he stood up. "Anything else you need moved?" I knew he was referring to the furniture, but the softness in his voice made it feel like he was asking something more, as if he sensed the undercurrent between us, even though neither of us dared to acknowledge it. I shook my head, brushing my hair behind my ear. "No, that's it. Thanks, Ben." He smiled again. This time, it felt different. There was a tension in the room now, a silence that wasn't entirely comfortable. For a moment, we just stood there, as if waiting for the other to say something to break whatever this was. "You okay?" Ben asked, his voice low. It was a simple question, but the concern in his tone made it feel heavier than it should. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded slowly, as if he didn't quite believe me, but wasn't pressing. He stepped closer, resting his hands on his hips, looking around the room. "You sure? You seem different tonight." I swallowed hard. He notices it too. He feels it. "It's just weird with Mark gone," I admitted, folding my arms across my chest. "The house feels so empty." I immediately regretted saying it. It sounded too much like an invitation, like I was hinting at something I didn't fully understand myself. Ben leaned against the wall, studying me quietly, the kind of person who never said more than necessary. And that made moments like this more dangerous. It was so easy to fill the silence with thoughts that shouldn't be there. "You know," he said slowly, "if you ever need anything, I'm here." It was a kind, friendly thing to say, but there was something in his tone that made my pulse quicken. "I know," I whispered, feeling the weight of his presence settle over me like a warm blanket. "I really appreciate it." For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something we hadn't planned for, something neither of us wanted to pull back from. Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Ben, can you stay a little longer?" His brow lifted slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask why, and he didn't need to. The way I said it made everything clear. It was a simple request on the surface, but the tension beneath it was impossible to ignore. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at the door as if reconsidering, and then he nodded, almost reluctantly, as if he knew leaving was the smarter choice, but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Yeah, he said quietly, I can stay. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Thanks, I whispered, my voice tight with emotion. I gestured toward the bed without thinking. Why don't you sit down? You've been on your feet all day. He hesitated again, but eventually crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands loosely clasped in his lap. I sat down beside him, just far enough to keep it from being suspicious, just close enough that it felt like we were testing something dangerous. The silence between us was thick, as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, the first confession. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, the way his shoulders tensed, aware of every tiny shift in the air between us. Ben, I began, not even sure what I wanted to say, but my voice cracked slightly, betraying the fragility of the moment. He turned to me, his expression softening in a way that made my heart ache. You're really not okay, are you? I shook my head, blinking back the tears that stung my eyes. I trailed off, struggling to find the words. It's hard, you know? Mark's always gone, and when he's here, it's like he's not really here. I hadn't meant to say it, but once the words were out, I couldn't take them back. Ben exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I get it, he said quietly. It's not easy being alone all the time. The way he said it made me wonder if he truly understood, if he had felt that same loneliness creeping in too. Without thinking, I rested my hand on his, a light, innocent touch. But it didn't feel innocent. It felt like I was opening a door I shouldn't open. He glanced down at our hands, his jaw tightening slightly, but he didn't pull away. We stayed like that for a moment, frozen, as if time had stopped. Ben, I whispered, my heart pounding. I knew I should stop, knew I was getting too close to the edge, but the words came out anyway, unbidden and reckless. Can you hold me just for a little while? His breath hitched, and I could see the struggle in his eyes, between doing what was right and what felt inevitable. I shouldn't, he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice. Please, I whispered, a tear slipping down my cheek, just for a moment. He let out a shaky breath, then slowly, almost cautiously, pulled me into his arms. His embrace was solid and warm, wrapping around me with tenderness that took me by surprise. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. It should have been comforting, just a friend holding another in a moment of weakness. But the way his fingers traced small circles on my back told me we had crossed into something else. Neither of us spoke. Words would have made it real, and neither of us was ready for that. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment, feeling a kind of closeness I hadn't felt in a long time. It was dangerous, intoxicating even, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Ben shifted slightly, enough for me to feel the tension in his body, the restraint he was holding onto. His chin brushed against my hair, and for a brief moment it felt like everything. The empty house, Mark's absence, the weight of guilt had melted away, leaving only us. Then, just as quickly, reality crashed back in. Ben exhaled sharply, loosening his grip around me, as though waking from a dream. I shouldn't have, he started, pulling away slightly. His voice was strained, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name, maybe regret or something close to it. No, I whispered, shaking my head. It's okay. You didn't do anything wrong. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge that this wasn't just a friendly embrace. He ran a hand down his face, frustration flashing across his expression. This can't happen. You know that, right? I know, I whispered, my throat tight. I needed someone tonight. His eyes softened for a moment, and it seemed like he might stay, like he might let the moment stretch a little longer, even though we both knew it couldn't. But then, slowly, he stood up, like it took all his willpower to pull away. I should go, he said quietly, his voice low. Before we both do something we can't take back. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My heart ached with the weight of what could have been, of what almost happened. Ben lingered by the door, his hand resting on the frame. You'll be okay? He asked softly, his eyes searching mine one last time. I'll be fine, I whispered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He gave me a small, sad smile in return, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence once again. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. I knew we had made the right choice. Ben had walked away, and nothing had really happened, but the weight of the almost lingered, heavy and suffocating. The next day, when Mark returned, he kissed me on the cheek and asked how everything had gone. I smiled and told him it had been fine, but that night, as I lay next to my husband, I knew something between Ben and me had changed. It was a moment we could never speak of, a line we hadn't crossed, but had come dangerously close to. And even though nothing had really happened, it had been enough to change everything. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.